I'm ready when you are.
Okay.
Just let it come around to 12, and that makes it easier for me to time, easier for you as well. And then you've got until 20 past for the presentation. Right, there you go.
Yeah, my topic of study was the GI resistance that formed out of the Vietnam War. And thank you for coming again. Vietnam produced opposition by soldiers and veterans on a scale and with an intensity never seen before. It began with isolated protests. As early as June 1965, Richard Stike, a West Point graduate in Vietnam, refused to board an aircraft, taking him to a remote Vietnamese village. The Vietnam War, he said, is not worth a single American life. Stike was court-martialed and dismissed from the service. The following year, three army privates, one black, one Puerto Rican, one Lithuanian Italian, all poor, refused to embark for Vietnam, denouncing the war as immoral, illegal, and unjust, and they were all court-martialed and imprisoned. The individual acts began to multiply. A black private in Oakland refused to board a troop plane to Vietnam, although he had faced 11 years at hard labour for his indiscipline. In the documentary Sir No Sir, the story of a Navy nurse is told. Lieutenant Susan Schnell was court-martialed for marching in a peace demonstration while in uniform, and for dropping anti-war leaflets from a plane on Navy installations. In the same documentary, an event in 1968 is retold, at the Presidio Stockade in California, where a guard shot to death an emotionally disturbed prisoner for walking away from a work detail. 27 prisoners then sat down and refused to work, singing "We Shall Overcome." They were all court-martialed, found guilty of mutiny, and sentenced to terms of up to 14 years, later reduced after much public attention and protest. Mixed with the present feeling against the war was resentment at the cruelty, the dehumanisation of military life, and in the army prisons, the stockades, this was especially true. The GI movement was born out of contradictions inherent in the military's project in Vietnam. Fighting a drawn-out guerrilla war in which Vietnamese civilians were indistinguishable from the enemy was for the average soldier a frustrating, unclear and violent project. Over and above this, however, were main contradictions within the military institution, where soldiers, drawn largely from the working class and the poor, are the ones asked to fight, to die, and to suspend their normal lives for a foreign policy that does not benefit them or seems far removed from the very fact of everyday base life. The majority of dissent from soldiers were those who volunteered, not the middle-class draftees. For African American soldiers, watching civil rights and black power activists fight and die at home for the American democracy they were supposed to defend abroad, the tension became even greater. Black soldiers, and largely working class volunteer soldiers, made up the bulk of the active GI movement because of these very reasons. The topic I was most interested in when researching GI resistance movement was undoubtedly that of the act known as fragging, purely because it can be considered the most dramatic evidence to represent just how troubled the US GI was within the military system. At the forefront, it appears to be deeply troubling that servicemen turned upon each other, utilising the distance of explosives to make powerful statements that are at the heart of many. The act itself, of knowingly throwing a firearm with intent and purpose, and yet the existence of a space between victim and perpetrator is interesting. The standard issue grenade granted to the GI, the M26, the M61, or the M67 fragmentation grenade, was not assigned by serial number and once detonated, therefore left no traceable evidence back to the perpetrator. I feel here I should make it clear that this kind of rebellion within military ranks is not subject to Vietnam alone, merely the termed act of fragging is. In Vietnam, fragging became known, accepted, and recognised with the US military. In 1971, Mark Mansfield, a Democrat leader, brought the terminology of fragging to the Senate arena, where in response, Charles Mattias, a Republican, noted, "In every war, a new vocabulary springs up. In all the lexicon of war, there is not a more tragic word than that of fragging. with all that it implies, a total failure of discipline and the depression of morale, the complete sense of frustration and confusion, and the loss of goals and hope itself. The Army's own statistics in relation to fragging incidents were reported as 86 deaths and over 700 injuries having taken place between the years of 1969 and 1972, where approximately 80% of victims were indeed officers. Even more alarmingly is the case that there were many, many more, since these statistics do not include incidents with other firearms, and thus it can be said that the US were fighting a war within a war against the other and a war against themselves. Over the course of the conflict, not only did jilted servicemen come to realise their importance of turning the tides of engagement in war, but the American administration came to terms with this too, although by this point it was too late and the damage had been done. The movement at home in the States and the movement within the military itself had already begun to demonstrate its power, largely due to the illegitimacy of the war in the first place. This power began to come to light when it was clear that both movements had effect on one another, and were no longer considered or conceived to be separate in their goals. This can be highlighted in the role of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War group, who contributed significantly to the growing majority of ending the war back home, and also, of course, the role it played within the military itself, offering support to GIs. During the Vietnam War, the military ranks carried out mass resistance on bases and ships in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, the US, and Europe. Military resistance was instrumental in ending the war by making the ranks politically unreliable. No longer could an officer be sure that his platoon was not plotting behind his back to harm him that very night. It became very apparent that the military machine was breaking down internally. It's important to note, however, that not all GIs were engaged in the movement when it came to be. Many broke the machine by simply resisting as individuals, undermining their own mission or delaying it. The GI movement was the decisive factor in the ending of the Vietnam War. Up until 1968, the desertion rate for US troops in Vietnam was still lower than in previous years. But by 1969, the desertion rate had increased fourfold. This wasn't limited to Southeast Asia. Desertion rates among GIs were on the increase worldwide. The soldiers in the combat zone, insubordination became an important part of avoiding horrible injury or death, with the primary goal being to get out of Vietnam alive. Once American officials realised they had little military personnel under their control, it became more apparent that there was a need to withdraw. The Tet Offensive of 1968 further stimulated this, and therefore the process of Vietnamization. The Tet Offensive marked the moment where all of America's problems within its military system were exposed. By no means a flat-out failure of military tactics, in fact, the very opposite. But nevertheless, 1968 marked a year of missed opportunity for America. Had the administration continued to utilise the droppings of bombs and increased its aerial prowess upon the landscape, focusing purely on technological might as opposed to infantry might, it could be theorised that America would have and could have gone on to win the war. Nonetheless, the dissent and desertion within the military revealed that psychological warfare was still of great importance. A tactical win for America turned into a blow to its efforts. Supposedly an end had been in sight, American officials had preached, and yet the Tet Offensive revealed Vietnam to still be a long and tiring ongoing conflict. However, the rebellion in the ranks didn't emerge simply in response to battlefield conditions. A civilian anti-war movement in the US had emerged on the coattails of the civil rights movement, at a time when the pacifism at any price tactics of civil rights leaders had reached their effective limit, and were being questioned by a younger, combative generation. Working class blacks and Latinos served in combat units out of all proportion to their numbers in American society, and groups such as the Black Panther Party and major urban riots in Watts, Detroit, Newark, all had an explosive effect on the consciousness of these men. After the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., major riots erupted in 181 US cities. At that point, the rulers of the United States were facing the gravest national crisis since the Civil War. The civil rights and anti-war movement at home was undoubtedly important and influential, but without the other, both movements, that of the GI movement and the anti-war civil rights movement would not have had the same impact alone. Those activists at home marched for justice and for the soldiers to be brought home. The soldiers protested to be brought home and for the war to end. GIs that resisted Vietnam are stereotyped as drug addicts, while civilian allies rallying for peace were labelled anti-American hippies. But both movements show that all forms of resistance are valid. Resistance can't be considered wrong because it is resistance. Resistance is resistance. The Vietnam syndrome, compared by Courtright to that of a disease, is still present within American involvement today. The war in Iraq largely depicts this, an unpopular war, where alienation within the military has occurred due to the knowledge of torture taking place, such as that of Abu Ghraib, the killings of innocent civilians, and issues of illegitimacy. Disillusionment within the army is also apparent. A report concluded by CBS News Dispatch in 2004, December the 6th, gave the figure of 5,000 desertions that took place. One soldier concluded to a journalist, "I didn't want, died deluded in Iraq over my gravestone." Another deserter told CBS that, "I was told in basic training that if I'm given an illegal or immoral order, it is my duty to disobey it, and I feel that invading and occupying Iraq is an illegal and immoral thing to do. My contract with the US government was to defend the Constitution of the US, not to take part in offensive and preemptive wars." The similarities to the Vietnam War continue, in that many dissenters stem from officer-soldier relations, where a feeling of unfair treatment, of not being considerate of safety, soldiers' lives cheapened by higher-ranking officers. The formation of Iraq Veterans Against the War is undoubtedly a nod towards the original creation of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War in 1967. Whereas rebellion within the ranks of the military present in Vietnam took years to spread in culmination, with Iraq, the opposition is already seemingly present. Can this be accounted for by the previous existence of a resistant movement within the military, the American military? Of course, while similarities can be drawn, the two do operate within a differing context. But I feel that the GI resistance in Vietnam serves as a constant reminder to those in powerful positions that there comes a point where any man or woman in an army uniform can no longer comply with the orders that are given to them. Despite the technological might that America held over their enemies, the war was lost, due to the cause of an unjust war which lacked popular support. It lost the support and confidence of its own military. GI resistance ultimately impeded the operational capacity of US forces, where the combination of combat refusals, fraggings, desertion, indiscipline and drug abuse, racial rebellion, underground movements and newspaper press all undermined its military effectiveness within Vietnam. The result was that America had to make the decision to withdraw. In order to preserve its tattered remains, the GI movement made the Vietnam War unwinnable. Popular war or otherwise, war is first won by those who are willing to fight in it. An excellent poem I came across that matches this sentiment, written by the German poet Bertolt Brecht in 1938, and it translates as follows. I'm just going to read it out. "General, your tank is a mighty vehicle. It shatters the forest and crushes 100 men, but it has one defect. It needs drivers. General, your bomber is awesome. It flies faster than a hurricane and bears more than an elephant, but it has one defect. It needs a mechanic. General, a man is quite expendable. He can fly and he can kill, but he has one defect. He can think." That's my presentation, so thank you.
Okay. Questions?
Okay, Natasha, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about first of all, about the civilian anti-war movement. I mean, to what extent was that a pacifist movement, and to what extent was it an anti-imperialist movement, or to what extent was it an anti-US government movement?
I feel in my presentation actually, I probably don't give enough credence and recognition to the civilian war movement at home. And I think largely that the anti-war movement, the counterculture back home in the 60s, the black liberation fronts, they were all key in creating a context that allowed for GI resistance to become noticed, to enable soldiers to revolt in the first place. And I don't think that the GI movement would have been possible with the above setting created by the civil rights movement. I think largely the important point to make is that the civil rights movement at first had its own goals that differed quite largely from that of the GI resistance movement. It was more concerned with civil rights back home, largely racial issues, more so than America's foreign relations. But this obviously quickly changed as the Vietnam War went on, and as Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, along with JF Kennedy, these kind of events stimulated the civil war the civil war movement in every possible way, and kind of gave the space for a unification of all fronts, racial fronts, and anti-imperial resistance against America's involvement in Vietnam.
So the anti-war movement at home, the civilian anti-war movement, it sounds as if you're suggesting that very much came out of the civil rights movement. Indeed, almost in a sense, was the same movement. I don't quite know. Can you tell me a bit more about the relationship between the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement? To what extent are they the same, and to what extent different?
They were different. They existed within their own political setting. It was over the course of the Vietnam War that these movements joined together and kind of unified under Vietnam, under the illegalness of its very nature. Civil rights quickly became human rights for soldiers in Vietnam, human rights for the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese who were suffering. I think that answers you.
Okay, so the anti-war movement, I mean, kind of before its convergence with the civil rights movement, where did that come from? What were its origins? Who was part of it?
Of the civil rights movement?
The anti-war movement.
The anti-war movement, sorry. Well, I think largely this is where the GI resistance movement comes into play, because the Vietnam Veterans Against the War were pivotal in kind of being that connection from the civilians at home to the soldiers serving in Vietnam. It offered support in the military to those GIs who were presently serving, but it also demonstrated back in America. They organised marches that civilians, anti-war movement, civilians, activists could participate in. So it kind of bridged that connection between the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement being here, and the GI resistance movement being here. It created like a bridge for a unification of resistance as a whole.
Okay, so the last question I think for me for the moment is, were there any tensions between the civilian anti-war movement and the GI resistance movement? Because often there are. I mean, often soldiers feel that civilians don't really understand the reality of the war itself. Sometimes civilians feel that opposition to the war shouldn't necessarily be framed in terms of the experiences of soldiers. So are any of those kinds of tensions or contradictions being played out in what you're describing as a kind of bridging?
Yeah, definitely, I would agree. I mean, naturally there has to be some kind of difference because of the context, civilians at home, GIs out in Vietnam, not everyone is going to think or believe the same things. I mean, there were GI soldiers who had the hawk mentality, that of, you know, America should be there, and there were those who obviously took that of the dove, you know, more peaceful resolvement. And likewise, there were civilians who believed that supporting the anti-war movements, the anti-war movement was wrong, because it ultimately said that we're not supporting our soldiers, we're not supporting our boys. So there was definitely tension. You know, not everyone jumped on the anti-war bandwagon, as it were, regardless of whether they served in Vietnam or not. So yeah, definitely, there were definite tensions between the two groups. But ultimately, overall, the two did unify, and I'm going back to the bridge, they did serve to support the other. The GI movement was supported the anti-war movement at home, and likewise the same for those in Vietnam.
Okay, I know I said that was my last question, but somebody
Okay,
just said,
sorry.
prompted another one. This will be the last one. It sounds as if in your answer there, you're saying that the GI resistance movement itself was not homogenous, in that there was actually a kind of a spectrum of different positions in relationship to the war. So could you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
As I said before, well, actually, I don't know if I've said before, but the GI movement wasn't all-encompassing. Not every single GI who served in Vietnam willingly or wantingly was a part of this movement. Some soldiers went to war because they did believe that America had a role to play, and a just role to play. Others, of course, kind of showed their resistance in minor forms. You know, not going out on the search and destroy missions, making their officers have to come and find them out in Vietnam. You know, sometimes they'd go off and on a search party operation, have a party, you know, engage in drug abuse and other stimulants, and then come back and not have carried out their mission. And this kind of counterculture within the Vietnam activists, well, those who were serving in Vietnam, was apparent. Not every single GI who went to serve in Vietnam was necessarily against the war. Most were more concerned with their own safety. I think actually that is probably the underlying reason for a lot of forms of resistance. Many were just concerned with getting home.
Can I ask you a little bit about the war itself?
Yeah.
You made a couple of really quite ambitious claims for the GI movement. I mean, you said at one point that it made the war unwinnable. At another time you said it was the decisive element in ending the Vietnam War. How confident are you in making those assertions?
I feel confident in making them, but I'm fully aware that to say it was the defining factor and not accounting for various other factors would be foolish to make the claim that that was the sole reason why the Vietnam War wasn't won. Despite that, I do strongly feel that the GI resistance movement did have a major role. You know, if you don't have an army, you can't win a war, unpopular war or not. If everyone at home in America is you know, demanding the war to be brought to an end, but you've still got a willing and ready to rock army, you've still got that kind of structure in place for engagement to continue. But the Vietnam War didn't have that. Vietnamization under Richard Nixon had to happen. So in many ways, I think that the GI resistance and military indiscipline were fundamental in reasons for why Vietnam can be continued in such a manner.
I mean, at another point, you also argued that maintaining a mass bombing campaign would have won the war. Do those two things contradict? Because if it's the army on the ground that's going to be decisive, then but isn't the mass bombing the alternative to that? If the army isn't reliable, then high-tech warfare bombing is the alternative, isn't it?
Yeah, I agree with you. It was the alternative. However, resistance within the military wasn't limited to purely just the general grunts, the GI infantry. High-tech volunteers and officers, engineers of that nature, Navy men, air pilots, they also formed a small part of the resistance movement on the whole. Therefore, whilst the main bulk of the GI resistance movement does stem from the GI, there were a large proportional amount of highly trained technical officers and servicemen and women who refused to do the same, who refused to carry out operations, who would revolt on naval bases, refused to set sail, refused to fly the planes. As in one case, I showed the nurse, what was her name? Sorry, Lieutenant Schnell, I think, Susan Schnell. She was marshalled for dropping anti-war leaflets from a plane on Navy installations. So it shows that across the border, across the whole military institution, resistance was everywhere, which made the tactic of wanting to drop bombs across the landscape hard and difficult, because resistance had spread across all platforms of America's military.
Okay, can I just go back to the answer you gave to my first question, suggesting that to argue that GI resistance was the main cause of the US failure in Vietnam would not be satisfactory. What are the alternatives? What do you see as the main alternative explanations for US failure in Vietnam?
I think the very nature of the campaign itself, that of guerrilla tactics, guerrilla warfare. The American military, whilst prior to Vietnam, was the best it had ever been. Yet, the kind of engagements it had been in prior didn't allow it to have that kind of relevant experience or knowledge of such a way of combat in guerrilla combat fighting style. The Vietnamese were at home; they were on their own territory. They knew the land. They had. There was more of them. There was a seemingly never-ending supply of them, and this is reflected in the Tet Offensive when the National Liberation Front seemingly lost thousands and thousands of volunteers, and yet America's win in the Tet Offensive seems to count for nothing, because purely on a numbers basis they had the advantage and they had the skill of the terrain. Another reason, I think, for the another factor is, of course, the anti-war movement at home. I wouldn't want to say that without that, Vietnam could have been winnable. It played a huge functioning role in driving support for the war to end. It stimulated the media, underground press and newspapers circulated not just in Vietnam but back home in the States. And ultimately it was a constant amount of pressure that was put upon the American administration to react and not just come back with, the war is long but we're winning and we're winning slowly. That wasn't good enough. And finally, after the Tet Offensive and the rioting across the United States, there came a point where Vietnamization was legitimately the only possible response to Vietnam as a whole. So I would say the factors of course the anti-war movement at home, the nature of the war itself, it was illegitimate in the first place. Largely, they I would say are the focal points for reasons why the Vietnam War were unwinnable, alongside with the nature of resistance that just spread throughout the institution, the military.
You said that the movement became about human rights as opposed to sort of civil rights. I was just wondering whether that was literally just for Americans or whether they included the Viet Cong in their sort of argument for the end of the war.
Yeah, definitely, that's a good point. It largely became about human rights all throughout Vietnam. The media made it seem that who America was fighting was this other, this unfamiliar face, this alien who differed in every way to that of the American GI. Humanity and compassion was seemingly lost, and the civilian anti-war movement largely took up the reins to combat this kind of notion or imagery of the other. And I think if you look at film representations such as that of Apocalypse Now, or indeed like the Green Berets movie, you can see that Hollywood has tried very hard to encourage this image of the Viet Cong being the other, to distance the humanity of and kind of disgusting nature of war itself. Again, if we look in The Sorrow of War, a book told from the perspective of a Vietnamese soldier, we get a different perspective. It kind of reminds us that these soldiers, no matter what side they're on, are humans too, have and deserve civil rights. And largely the anti-war movement became an international based scale that centered on human rights and not just American rights.
You made a comparison to Iraq, and
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if, after the GI resistance movement in Vietnam, if there's any evidence of the American army being more considerate to GIs that were resistant to wars that they were involved in.
So, sorry, do you mean soldiers who are now present in Iraq, if there's been changes within the military system to show?
Yeah, to maybe consider their human rights as individuals rather than just soldiers.
I don't feel 100% comfortable. Sorry, in backing up those notions, because my knowledge of Iraq doesn't stretch that far, and I wouldn't want to make any false claims or false judgments. But I would assume that the GI movement that stemmed from Vietnam has had a rather large role in that of the way America has gone about itself in Iraq, because as I mentioned, there exists this kind of Vietnam syndrome, this kind of lingering disease which makes America very cautious in regards to every kind of foreign affairs relation it gets itself involved in. But at the same time, merely from Iraq Veterans Against the War, that organisation being present, certainly I'd suggest that militarily resistance is still high, but that could purely be based upon, again, the illegitimacy of the Iraq War. So yeah, I'd definitely say that resistance still exists. Whether treatment of Iraqi soldiers is different to that of those who served in Vietnam, I don't feel comfortable enough to make the claim that it's the same or it does differ. So yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't answer your question.
Could you maybe tell us a bit more about race as a factor in resistance, particularly race as a factor in resistance, either or both, in the civilian anti-war movement or in the GI movement?
Race was obviously a huge issue. It was largely, different ethnicities that were forced to serve in Vietnam for one reason or another. Some were poor, some working class, poor. Others went into the military service to avoid prison sentences or to avoid any kind of punishment that they had been bribed with. And race amongst soldiers is interesting because the key to the GI resistance movement is to remove the stigma of race, to not see a black soldier standing beside you, standing beside a white GI soldier, and supporting the same kind of notion. The issue of race, it's definitely one which I should have focused on more, because I feel it goes hand in hand with the very nature of the civil rights movement and what they were fighting for. It became very hard for black GIs to stand alongside white GIs and fight for the same reasons, because simply a black American GI was a second-class citizen. He did not have the same rights as a white GI serviceman. He felt more akin to that of the Viet Cong in the way that he was seen as an other, as a less, as something that, something more akin to the Viet Cong. And if we look at Muhammad Ali and his declaration that no Viet Cong ever called me nigger, that in itself, it kind of speaks volumes about America's expectation to be able to send in GIs and servicemen of any colour, of any creed, of any heritage, and expect them to all do and perform the same job when none of them were treated the same or treated with the same rights.
So even though at home, sort of like the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement were sort of working together,
Yeah.
in the way that they wanted change, like in Vietnam, it was a different story then.
I think racial tensions within Vietnam, it was a different story largely at first, because as I've already tried to address, there existed tensions within platoons with racial kind of hatred existed amongst draftees and who were drafted into the Vietnam War. But as the movement went on, and the bridge began to form once again between civil rights, racial rights movement began to bridge with the GI resistance movement, it became very apparent that before resistance could be achieved on the whole, there needed to be the breaking down of these racial tensions and these racial barriers that prevented the GI resistance moving as one unit, as opposed to here is the civil rights movement and the Black Panthers organisation. Instead of it being I'm the civil rights working to fight for one thing and the Black Panthers working to fight for another, it became an encompassing kind of umbrella. It became that every single form of resistance was valid and was ultimately fighting towards the same kind of goals.
Can I just ask you about the? I think I was right. I'm right in hearing you say that the resistance tended not to come from conscripts. Why was that?
Well, yeah, the conscripts, the draftees, largely came from working class backgrounds. Working class backgrounds, poorly educated, very young, and therefore they were more likely to just want to get out, to do the job, go in there for 1 or 2 years, serve the time, and make their way back home. Whereas those who volunteered had spent more time within the military kind of institution. These volunteers were educated to a high level, not a higher level, college education. They had more kind of an interest in being active in politics, an interest in being active with the civil rights movement at home. They were more likely to be influenced by organisations around them that opened their eyes in the sense. They were more likely to find the GI resistance movement than those who just wanted to duck their heads and get home alive. It is a common misconception that draftees were the less likely to. The draftees were more likely to be involved in the anti-war movement as a whole. But yeah, it was largely the main the main numbers that made up the resistance were definitely those of who were who volunteered into the army, who went themselves and made their own kind of minds up about what they saw in Vietnam and what they saw they disliked.
Yes, I mean, the picture you're drawing there surprises me slightly because it would have appeared to me that the conscripts actually were more likely to be from a broad range of social backgrounds, because the draft impacted upon all young people within, all young men within the US. So you had, draftees coming from universities, from colleges, whereas volunteers were often in a position where they were volunteering for the army as an alternative to unemployment or dead-end jobs. So in what you're suggesting comes as quite a surprise to me.
I suppose this could be accounted for. Those who were more educated, those who had a different kind of working background, they were more likely to end up in the kind of NCO officer roles, and therefore, in being a part of that kind of ranking system within the military was incredibly dangerous because of incidents such as fragging, refusal to listen to officers' orders. So that kind of job within the military was considered quite dangerous and hazardous to those who were able to fill those roles. Many, didn't have relevant army experience. Many were thrown headfirst into the role. And the thing about Vietnam is that soldiers would serve a year, would do a tour of service, and then be completely removed and put somewhere else. And so the combat effectiveness and bonding with your fellow soldiers in your platoon became very difficult, which kind of reinforced the feeling of wanting to get out of Vietnam as quickly as possible in one piece.
Okay, thank you. That's time. Thank you.